Mara Fletcher had always been meticulous. From the way she organized her wardrobe by color to how she arranged her files alphabetically on her work desk, Mara found comfort in order. Her husband Daniel often teased her about it, but deep down, he admired her commitment to detail. They were that kind of couple, the kind that had worked through differences, weathered hardships, and built a life together with routines that wrapped them in security and familiarity. This business trip was no different. Every year, Mara's firm held its annual summit in San Francisco, a gathering of high-powered minds from across the company's global offices. Daniel knew the drill. She'd be gone for 5 days, with an itinerary packed with meetings, breakout sessions, and obligatory dinners. Though he would miss her, he knew she'd come back energized, excited about new strategies, and eager to share every detail. As she packed, Daniel stood by the bedroom door, leaning on the frame, watching her fold clothes with surgical precision. He often joked that her suitcase could pass a military inspection, which usually earned him a good-natured eye roll and a laugh. "Got everything you need?" he asked, glancing at the stacks of clothes she had laid out. Mara nodded, pausing to look up at him with a faint smile. "I think so, just the usual stuff. I even remembered to pack the charging cables this time." "Oh, a miracle," he teased, stepping forward and pulling her into a gentle hug. "Just don't forget the small stuff, okay?" "I won't," she said softly, nestling into his embrace. "I know I'll miss you. The bed always feels empty when you're not in it." With her bag finally packed, she gave him a lingering kiss and then departed, leaving Daniel to spend the next few days with the house to himself. Normally, he would have spent the time catching up on his own hobbies, maybe reconnecting with some old friends. But this time, an odd sense of unease crept into his thoughts as soon as she left. He tried to brush it off as simply the usual longing he felt when she was away, but it nagged at him. Meanwhile, on the flight to San Francisco, Mara found herself unusually restless. She usually enjoyed these trips, but this time, a strange heaviness settled over her. She looked out of the window as the plane sliced through clouds, trying to calm the tumult within her. In San Francisco, the summit began with the usual pomp. Mara moved through her agenda, attending presentations, taking notes, and catching up with colleagues from other branches. She was a rising star in her company, her analytical mind and ability to make tough calls quickly setting her apart. But this year, something felt different, as if she was caught between two lives. On the second night of the conference, after an intensive day of workshops, Mara's team gathered at a local bar. The atmosphere was lively. Colleagues laughed, shared stories, and enjoyed the reprieve from the day's demands. But Mara wasn't quite herself. She kept glancing at her phone, scrolling through Daniel's texts, and smiling at his playful remarks and simple goodnight messages. Then came the unexpected. As Mara sipped her wine, a voice from behind her cut through the hum of the crowd. "I didn't think I'd see you here." She turned around, her breath catching at the sight of the man standing before her. His name was Richard, an old friend from her college days. He was tall, his dark hair now flecked with silver, his smile just as captivating as she remembered. Memories of late-night study sessions, road trips, and the endless, impassioned conversations they'd shared flooded her mind. "Richard, what are you doing here?" she stammered, her surprise mixed with genuine delight. "I work in the city now. I saw a familiar face and thought it couldn't be you, but," he chuckled, "here you are." They spent the next hour catching up, laughing about old stories, and recounting memories that seemed both distant and achingly close. Mara found herself transported to another time, as if her life with Daniel had briefly faded, replaced by an echo of her younger self. As the night wore on, Richard suggested they move to a quieter place, a small bistro down the street, to continue their conversation. Against her better judgment, Mara agreed, her heart racing as she followed him out of the bar. The bistro was dimly lit, with an atmosphere that felt almost conspiratorial. The tables were close, but private enough to shield conversations from neighboring patrons. Mara and Richard took a corner table, the soft glow of a candle flickering between them, illuminating their faces and deepening the nostalgia that wrapped around them like an old, familiar coat. The conversation flowed easily, a steady rhythm of shared stories, forgotten dreams, and laughter. It was as if the years between them had dissolved, leaving only the warm memories of who they used to be. For Mara, it was exhilarating, almost intoxicating. She'd forgotten how easy it was to be around someone who knew her before her career, before her responsibilities, before the weight of expectations had settled firmly on her shoulders. "You look exactly the same," Richard said, smiling across the table at her. "I can't believe it's been so long. I mean, what's it been? 15 years?" "Closer to 20, Mara replied, shaking her head in disbelief. "Time flies, doesn't it?" Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment, she saw something in his gaze that unsettled her. It was a look that carried an unspoken question, a look that hinted at the possibility of rekindling something left unfinished. "So," Richard said, clearing his throat, "are you happy, Mara?" The question hung between them, heavy and complicated. Mara hesitated, caught off guard by its directness. Happy? She loved Daniel, of course, but the life they'd built was predictable, safe, and maybe a little too comfortable. Somewhere along the way, she realized she had started to feel invisible. Daniel was always supportive, always there, but he'd become almost a fixture in her life rather than a force that stirred her passion or challenged her. "Yes," she answered, though the word sounded hollow. "I'm happy. Daniel's a good man." Richard raised an eyebrow, catching the hesitation in her voice. "A good man," he repeated with a smile that bordered on skeptical. "That sounds like a safe answer." She looked away, biting her lip, trying to banish the fleeting doubt. But Richard's presence stirred something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of being truly seen, understood in a way that went beyond familiarity. They talked for hours, sharing stories, memories, and the unspoken regrets that colored both their lives. Finally, as the bistro was about to close, Richard leaned closer. "Mara," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper, "I never stopped thinking about you." She felt her heart stammer in her chest, his words both thrilling and terrifying. She knew this was dangerous territory, a place she'd sworn she would never go. But in that moment, the weight of her carefully constructed life felt suffocating. She longed to feel alive, to recapture the thrill of spontaneity, the feeling of being swept away by something she couldn't control. And then, as if surrendering to an inevitable pull, she closed her eyes and leaned toward him, her breath catching as his lips met hers. It was gentle at first, almost hesitant, as if both of them were testing the waters. But soon, the kiss deepened, carrying with it all the unspoken emotions, the what-ifs, and the unrealized dreams they'd both left behind. The world around them faded. In that stolen moment, Mara felt the weight of her responsibilities lift, replaced by a reckless, intoxicating thrill that left her both exhilarated and guilty. They spent the night together in Richard's apartment, a small but elegant space with a view of the city's skyline. It felt surreal, like stepping into a different life, a life she had once imagined but had never dared to pursue. But when dawn broke, reality came crashing down. As Mara lay beside Richard, watching the first light seep through the curtains, a wave of shame washed over her. She hadn't planned this, hadn't wanted it, but here she was, lying in another man's bed with a weight in her chest she couldn't ignore. Slipping out of bed, she quietly gathered her clothes, her hands shaking as she dressed. She glanced back at Richard, his face peaceful in sleep, and felt a pang of guilt. This wasn't him. It was her choices, her actions. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. With her heart pounding, she left the apartment, stepping into the cool morning air. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling as if she were standing on the edge of a precipice, teetering on the brink of a terrible fall. Back at her hotel, she stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, her face pale and drawn, her eyes haunted by what she'd done. The thrill, the escape, all of it felt hollow now. She wanted to blame Richard to convince herself that it was just a fleeting moment of weakness. But she knew the truth. She had made the choice, and she would have to live with it. As she prepared for the final day of the conference, her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She tried to bury her guilt, to focus on her work, but every moment was tainted by the knowledge of what she'd done. Little did she know, this was only the beginning. The conference ended, and Mara boarded her flight home with a sense of dread. The memories of her night with Richard lingered like shadows, impossible to shake. She knew she couldn't hide forever, but she didn't know how to face Daniel, the man who'd trusted her so completely. 1,000 excuses and explanations swirled in her mind, but none of them felt sufficient. None of them could undo what had been done. As the plane touched down, she steeled herself, rehearsing the casual greetings she'd use, the stories she'd tell him about the conference, and the little souvenirs she'd bought to smooth things over. She convinced herself that one mistake didn't define her, that it was a momentary lapse in judgment, a misguided escape from a life she still valued. When Mara arrived home, Daniel greeted her with his usual warm embrace, his face lighting up as he took her bag and set it by the door. "Welcome home," he murmured, pulling her close. "I missed you." She forced a smile, hoping he couldn't feel the stiffness in her posture. "I missed you too," she replied, her voice strained. She let him take her hand and lead her into the living room, where he'd set out her favorite snacks and poured 2 glasses of wine. Her guilt grew sharper with every thoughtful gesture, every kind word he spoke. Over the next few days, Mara tried to fall back into their familiar routine, focusing on work and chores, burying herself in tasks to drown out the remorse that gnawed at her insides. But the guilt wouldn't fade. It only grew. And soon, Daniel began to notice the changes in her behavior. The way she seemed distant, distracted. The way she avoided his gaze and flinched at his touch. "Is everything okay?" he asked one night, his voice tinged with concern. "You've seemed a little off since you got back." She forced a smile, struggling to steady her voice. "Of course, just tired from the conference, I guess." He nodded, though he didn't look convinced. "You know you can tell me anything, right? Whatever it is, I'm here." The sincerity in his voice cut through her like a knife, and she could feel the cracks forming in the fragile mask she'd constructed. But she nodded, forcing herself to hold it together. She knew she had to protect him from the truth, to shield him from the pain she'd caused. She couldn't bear to see his trust in her shattered, to watch his heart break because of her betrayal. But Daniel was perceptive. He began to notice the small details, the way she lingered on her phone a little longer than usual, the subtle shifts in her expressions when she thought he wasn't looking. He didn't press her, didn't push for answers. Instead, he watched, silently piecing together the fragments of her behavior, trying to make sense of the growing distance between them. Then one evening, Mara's phone buzzed with a message while she was in the shower. Daniel, curious, glanced at the screen and saw a name he didn't recognize, Richard. His heart raced as he scrolled through the messages, reading words that left him breathless, his mind reeling with shock and disbelief. There it was, spelled out in casual messages. The truth he'd feared but hadn't dared to confront. The laughter they'd shared, the late-night conversations, the kiss that had led to a night she'd hidden from him. All of it was there, a grim confirmation of his worst suspicions. He felt his pulse hammering in his ears as he read the messages, each line stoking a fury he'd never felt before. He dropped her phone on the counter, struggling to catch his breath, his mind swirling with anger, betrayal, and a cold, calculated resolve. When Mara stepped out of the shower, she found Daniel waiting for her, his expression unreadable, his eyes dark with a calm intensity that chilled her to the bone. "Mara," he said quietly, his voice steady and controlled. "We need to talk." She froze, her heart plummeting as she saw the phone on the counter, its screen still lit with the messages from Richard. Her mind raced, panic setting in as she scrambled to find the right words. But Daniel's gaze held her in place, leaving her speechless. "I saw the messages," he continued, his voice so calm it was almost unnerving. "So don't bother with excuses." Her world shattered in that moment, the walls of her carefully constructed life crumbling around her. She could see the pain in his eyes, the betrayal that cut deeper than words could express. She opened her mouth to speak, but he held up a hand, silencing her. "You were going to keep this from me, weren't you?" he asked, his tone icy. "You were going to lie to my face and pretend nothing happened." "Daniel, please," she began, her voice trembling. "It was a mistake. I didn't mean for it to happen. I was confused. A mistake? He repeated, his voice barely a whisper. That's all you can say? She felt tears sting her eyes as she reached out to him, desperate to explain, to make him understand. I know I hurt you, and I'm so sorry. I love you, Daniel. It was just one night, and it didn't mean anything. It was a stupid, thoughtless mistake, and I'll do anything to make it right. But he didn't move, didn't soften. Instead, he looked at her with a cold detachment that frightened her. I need time, he said finally, his voice like steel. I don't know if I can forgive you for this, Mara. I don't know if I even want to try. She felt her heart break as she watched him turn away, his shoulders tense, his jaw set with a resolve that told her he was already planning something. The warmth, the trust, the love they'd shared, all of it had been shattered, replaced by a darkness she couldn't reach. Over the next few days, Daniel withdrew, his silence more punishing than any words could have been. Mara felt herself unraveling, desperate to repair the damage, to rebuild the trust she'd broken. But every time she tried to reach out, to apologize, to explain, he pulled away, his expression hard and unreadable. And then one evening he came to her with an offer. Let's go away for a weekend, he suggested, his tone neutral. Maybe it'll help us clear the air. The idea filled her with a strange mixture of hope and dread. She knew she didn't deserve his forgiveness, but she clung to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he was willing to try. She agreed, hoping that this trip could somehow mend the rift between them. But Daniel had something else in mind. As they packed their bags, he watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. And when they set out for the cabin he'd rented, Mara felt an unsettling sense of foreboding, a tension that simmered beneath his calm exterior. What she didn't know was that Daniel had no intention of forgiving her. The cabin was nestled deep within the woods, far from any neighbors or towns. The isolation was striking, an unspoken reminder of how alone Mara and Daniel truly were. The dense trees surrounded them like silent spectators, their dark forms looming against the twilight sky as they arrived. Mara stepped out of the car, breathing in the cool, crisp air, hoping the peaceful setting might ease the tension between them. Daniel unloaded their bags in silence, his face a mask of calm that gave nothing away. She tried to break the silence, to bridge the chasm that had grown between them. It's beautiful here, she ventured, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, he replied simply, glancing at her with a look that was both distant and piercing. It's a good place to clear one's head. The cabin itself was cozy, with a stone fireplace, rustic wooden beams, and large windows that framed the towering pines outside. It felt both inviting and unnervingly quiet, a stark contrast to the tension simmering between them. Mara busied herself unpacking, setting their things down, trying to ease the nervous energy building within her. As night fell, Daniel lit a fire in the fireplace, the flames casting flickering shadows across the room. They sat across from each other, the firelight illuminating their faces, revealing every unspoken emotion, every hidden fear. So, he began, breaking the silence, tell me again why it happened. Mara looked down, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. She had gone over the reasons in her head 100 times, but none of them sounded sufficient. None of them felt enough. I was lonely, I guess, she said finally, her voice soft and unsteady. I felt like something was missing, like I'd lost a part of myself. And when I saw Richard, it reminded me of a time when I felt different. Different? He echoed, his voice sharp, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her shiver. You mean happier? No, not happier, she said quickly, shaking her head. Just free, I guess. I know it sounds ridiculous, but it was a moment of weakness, Daniel. I never stopped loving you. I just lost my way. He leaned back, his gaze unrelenting. Lost your way, he repeated, his voice dripping with bitterness. And in that moment, you decided to throw away everything we've built. Tears pricked at her eyes as she struggled to find the right words. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to make things right. I'll do anything, Daniel. I'll go to therapy, I'll earn back your trust, whatever it takes. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, and walked over to the kitchen, where he poured 2 glasses of wine. He handed her one, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "To trust," he said, his voice cold, lifting his glass in a mock toast. She hesitated, feeling the weight of his gaze, but lifted her glass and took a sip. They spent the rest of the evening in a strained silence, the fire crackling softly as the tension thickened. Daniel's behavior remained unsettlingly calm, his face impassive, giving her no hint of what he was thinking or feeling. She began to wonder if this trip had been a mistake, if perhaps he wasn't ready to forgive, or if he ever would be. As the night wore on, Mara began to feel drowsy, her vision blurring slightly as she struggled to keep her eyes open. She glanced at her wine glass, realizing she hadn't even finished it. Yet she felt overwhelmingly tired, her limbs heavy, her thoughts muddled. "Daniel," she murmured, her voice slurred. "I don't feel so good." He watched her with a calm, detached expression. "Why don't you lie down, Mara?" he suggested, his voice soothing. "You need your rest." Her head swam as she tried to make sense of his words, but her body felt leaden, her eyelids drooping despite her efforts to stay awake. She sank into the couch, her mind drifting in and out of consciousness as the world around her blurred. When she awoke, it was morning, and sunlight filtered through the windows, casting a soft glow across the cabin. But something was wrong. Her hands were bound with rope, her wrists tied securely to the arms of the chair she was sitting in. Her heart pounded as she tried to move, but her legs were also tied, her movements restricted, her body immobilized. "Daniel!" she cried, panic rising in her chest. What are you doing?" He stood in front of her, his expression calm, almost serene. "Good morning, Mara," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "Did you sleep well?" "Daniel, please," she pleaded, her voice shaking. "This isn't funny. Let me go." He tilted his head, studying her with a detached curiosity. "Oh, I'm not trying to be funny," he replied. "I just thought we could have a little talk. Heart to heart, if you will." Her pulse raced as she stared at him, realizing the depth of his anger, the darkness in his eyes that she'd never seen before. "Daniel, I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but please, let me go. This isn't you." He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Isn't me? Maybe you don't know me as well as you think, Mara. Maybe the man you thought you loved was just a facade, just like the life you pretended was enough for you." She struggled against the ropes, panic surging through her. "Please, Daniel," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "I'll do anything, just let me go." But he didn't move, didn't soften. Instead, he leaned in close, his face inches from hers, his eyes filled with a cold fury that chilled her to the bone. "You want me to forgive you? To forget what you did?" he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But that's not going to happen. You broke my heart, Mara. You betrayed me in the worst possible way. And now you're going to understand what it feels like to lose control, to be at someone else's mercy." Her mind raced, fear and regret overwhelming her as she realized the full extent of what he was capable of. She had underestimated him, had thought he was too gentle, too forgiving to ever seek revenge. But now, as she stared into his cold, unflinching eyes, she saw a side of him she had never known existed. "Daniel, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." He straightened, his expression hardening. "It's too late for apologies, Mara," he said, his voice like steel. "Now, it's my turn to decide what happens next." And with that, he turned away, leaving her bound and helpless, the echoes of his footsteps fading as he disappeared into the shadows of the cabin. She was left alone, the silence heavy and oppressive, her mind racing as she struggled against the ropes. But there was no escape, no way to undo the choices she had made, the lines she had crossed. In that moment, she understood the depth of his pain, the cruelty of her betrayal. And as she sat there, bound and terrified, she realized that whatever fate he had planned for her, she had no one to blame but herself. Mara's mind whirred as she sat bound to the chair, her body aching from her struggles. She didn't know how much time had passed since Daniel had left her alone, but each second felt like an eternity. Her wrists were raw from the ropes, her throat parched. She strained to hear any sound, any hint of movement that might signal his return. At last, the door creaked open, and Daniel stepped back into the room. His face was calm, almost eerily so, as he set a tray down on the table. On it were a glass of water and a plate with a single piece of bread. He picked up the glass and held it to her lips, tilting it slightly to let her drink. "Why are you doing this?" she rasped, her voice weak. "I'm your wife, Daniel. You loved me once." He held her gaze, a flicker of something unreadable passing over his face. "I did love you," he said quietly, as if speaking to himself. "And that's what makes this all the worse, doesn't it?" He set the glass down and took a seat across from her, his face impassive. "Tell me, Mara," he said, his voice low and steady. "What was it about him that made you throw everything away? Was he charming? Did he promise you some kind of adventure?" Her throat tightened as she struggled to find the words. "It wasn't about him," she whispered, her voice thick with guilt. "It was about me. I was afraid, I guess, afraid of feeling stuck." He laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "Stuck," he repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "Stuck in a life you agreed to, a life you chose, and yet, when things got too predictable, you decided to gamble it all, to lie, to betray me." She opened her mouth to respond, but he held up a hand, silencing her. "You don't get to speak," he said, his voice cold and final. "Not anymore. You lost that right when you made your choice." He stood and walked over to a cabinet, opening it to reveal a small, old-fashioned tape recorder. Mara's pulse quickened as he brought it over, setting it on the table in front of her. "I'm going to give you one last chance," he said, his gaze unyielding. "You're going to tell me everything. Every detail, every lie, every secret. And when you're done, we'll see if there's anything left worth saving." She felt her heart sink as she stared at the tape recorder, realizing that this was not just about revenge. It was a trial, a test of her remorse, her honesty. She hesitated, her mind racing through the consequences of confessing everything, of laying her betrayal bare in such a raw, undeniable way. But she knew she had no choice. If she wanted any hope of forgiveness, of redemption, she would have to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. For the next hour, Mara spoke in halting, broken sentences, recounting every moment of her betrayal, from the chance meeting with Richard to the messages they had exchanged, to that night in his apartment. With each word, she felt the weight of her guilt grow heavier, the shame pressing down on her like a physical force. Daniel listened in silence, his face expressionless, giving nothing away. When she finished, she looked at him, her eyes pleading, her voice barely a whisper. "I've told you everything, Daniel. I swear, there's nothing left to hide." He sat in silence for a long moment, his eyes fixed on her with a steely intensity. Then, without a word, he picked up the tape recorder, turned it off, and slipped it into his pocket. "Thank you for your honesty," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "But it changes nothing." She felt her heart plummet, despair overwhelming her as she realized that her confession, her pleas, had fallen on deaf ears. "Daniel, please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging you, don't throw everything away because of one mistake. We can work through this. We can find a way." He looked at her, a cold glint in his eyes. "You destroyed our life with your choices, Mara. You took everything we built and threw it away. And now, I'm going to make sure you feel the same emptiness, the same pain." Without another word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope, dropping it onto her lap. She stared at it, confusion mingling with dread, as she realized what it was. Divorce papers, neatly signed, his decision already made. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, you can't do this." "It's already done," he replied, his voice like ice. "You wanted freedom, didn't you? Well, now you have it." With that, he turned and walked toward the door, his movements steady, purposeful. She struggled against her bonds, desperation flooding her as she called out after him. "Please, Daniel, don't leave me here. Don't do this." But he didn't look back. He stepped outside, closing the door behind him with a finality that echoed through the empty cabin. Mara sat there, bound and helpless, the weight of her choices pressing down on her as the silence enveloped her. Hours passed and night fell, the cabin growing colder as the fire burned down to embers. She called out for help, her voice hoarse, but there was no one to hear her, no one to rescue her from the prison of her own making. As the darkness closed in, she realized the full extent of Daniel's plan. He hadn't just left her physically. He had taken everything with him, the security, the comfort, the love that had once filled her life. And in that cold, empty cabin, Mara understood the depths of his revenge, the cruelty of his punishment. She was truly alone. In the end, Daniel had made her feel exactly what he had felt, the unbearable, aching emptiness of betrayal. And as she sat in the dark, the silence heavy around her, she knew that his revenge was complete.